Hey there, and welcome to a tranquil journey through the long, slow, and often imperceptible decline of one of history's most enduring empires, Rome. Settle in, find a comfortable spot, and allow the gentle cadence of this chronicle to wash over you, carrying you back through the centuries to a time when Rome seemed eternal, yet was already beginning its quiet descent. We are not here to witness a sudden dramatic collapse, but rather to observe the subtle fraying of threads, the gradual erosion of foundations, and the countless small decisions that over a span of several hundred years reshaped the entire Western world. Our story begins not with an ending, but with a peak, a radiant moment of apparent invincibility. Imagine, if you will, the Roman Empire in the mid-2nd century after the birth of Christ. This was the era of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period often lauded as the high water mark of Roman power and prosperity, from the windswept moors of Britannia in the far northwest, where Hadrian's Great Wall snaked across the landscape, marking the very edge of the known civilized world, all the way to the sun-drenched sands of Mesopotamia in the east. Rome held sway. Its vast territories stretched from the temperate forests of Germania to the fertile plains of North Africa, encompassing a dizzying array of cultures, languages, and peoples, all bound together by the formidable machinery of Roman law, administration, and military might. This was an empire of truly colossal scale. The roads, meticulously engineered and often paved, crisscrossed the landscape like a network of veins, allowing legions to march swiftly and goods to flow with relative ease. Great aqueducts, monumental arches of stone and mortar, carried fresh water to bustling cities like Rome itself, Alexandria, and Antioch, nurturing populations that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Grand forums, majestic temples, and imposing amphitheaters stood as testaments to Roman architectural prowess and civic pride, embodying a shared sense of identity and purpose across an enormous geographical expanse. Even the very air seemed to hum with a quiet confidence, a belief in the perpetual nature of Roman order. Under emperors such as Trajan, Hadrian, and the early Antonines, particularly Antoninus Pius, the empire experienced a period of unparalleled internal stability and relative peace along its vast frontiers. Trade flourished, agriculture thrived, and a sophisticated legal system ensured a degree of justice and order that was remarkable for its time. A common coinage facilitated commerce, and a largely unified language, Latin in the West and Greek in the East, allowed for communication and cultural exchange across immense distances. For many living within its borders, the Roman Empire truly represented civilization, a bulwark against the perceived barbarism that lay beyond its frontiers. The thought of this colossal structure ever crumbling, ever fading away, would have seemed utterly preposterous, an unthinkable absurdity. Yet, even in this golden age, subtle, almost imperceptible cracks were beginning to form, like hairline fractures in a magnificent statue that only the most discerning eye might notice. The sheer scale of the empire, while a source of strength, was also a burgeoning administrative challenge. Governors in distant provinces often acted with considerable autonomy, and the central authority, while powerful, sometimes struggled to impose its will uniformly across such a vast domain. Maintaining the legions, those disciplined fighting machines that guaranteed the Pax Romana, was an expensive undertaking, consuming a significant portion of the imperial budget. The frontiers, though largely quiet, were never truly static. Beyond the walls and rivers, the Germanic tribes, the Sarmatians, and the Persians watched, learned, and occasionally probed, testing the strength of Roman defenses. These were not immediate threats, but rather a constant low-level hum of pressure, a persistent reminder of a world that lay beyond Roman control. Then, around the year 165 AD, a new and terrifying force entered the stage, one that cared nothing for walls, legions, or emperors. This was the Antonine Plague, a devastating epidemic that swept across the empire, carried, it is believed, by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. Historical sources suggest it was likely a strain of smallpox or perhaps measles, though its precise nature remains a subject of scholarly debate. Regardless of its exact biological identity, its impact was profound and chilling. The plague arrived insidiously, a silent killer spreading through trade routes, military camps, and crowded cities. Symptoms would begin with fever, often followed by severe skin eruptions, internal bleeding, and agonizing pain. Death could come swiftly or linger for days, slowly draining the life from its victims. The scale of the mortality was staggering. Contemporary accounts, though likely exaggerated in their exact figures, speak of entire cities being decimated, regions losing a third or even half of their strength, and vast tracts of agricultural land left untended due to labor shortages. The venerated physician Galen, who witnessed the plague firsthand, described its horrifying effects, noting the widespread panic and the sheer difficulty of containing its spread. This plague, which recurred in waves until around 180 AD, was not a sudden, empire-shattering blow. Rome did not fall because of it. Instead, its effects were more insidious, more like a slow, creeping poison. It severely reduced the population, leading to a significant decrease in manpower for both the army and the crucial agricultural sector. Fewer taxpayers meant less revenue for the imperial treasury, and fewer farmers meant a strain on food supplies. The economy, which had thrived on robust trade and abundant labor, began to stutter. Moreover, the psychological impact was immense. The Pax Romana had fostered a sense of security and divine favor. But the plague shattered this illusion, introducing an element of unpredictable terror and undermining faith in the stability of the world. It was a stark reminder of humanity's vulnerability, even within the most powerful empire the world had ever known. This era of relative peace, then, ended not with a bang, but with a plague and a whimper. The reigns of the last Antonine emperors, Marcus Aurelius and his erratic son Commodus, saw increasing military pressures on the frontiers and a growing sense of unease within the empire. The death of Commodus in 192 AD plunged Rome into a turbulent period of civil war, a stark departure from the smooth successions that had characterized much of the previous century. Out of this chaos, a new dynasty emerged, one that would significantly alter the course of Roman history and, inadvertently, hasten its long-term decline. This was the Severan Dynasty, founded by Lucius Septimius Severus. His rise to power was a brutal and protracted affair, involving multiple contenders for the imperial purple. Severus was a man forged in the crucible of military discipline and practical ambition, rather than the refined philosophical traditions of the Antonines. He hailed from Leptis Magna, a thriving port city in North Africa, a testament to the increasing diversity of Rome's leadership. His background was equestrian, not senatorial, and he rose through the ranks of the military and civil administration through sheer competence and ruthless determination. After defeating his rivals, notably Pescennius Niger in the east and Clodius Albinus in the west, Septimius Severus solidified his grip on power. His reign, from 193 to 211 AD, marked a pivotal shift in the fundamental character of the Roman state. Severus understood, perhaps more acutely than any emperor before him, that the true power in Rome now resided with the legions. His famous, perhaps apocryphal, dying advice to his sons, Caracalla and Geta, encapsulated this new reality: enrich the soldiers, scorn all others. This was not just a cynical remark. It was a guiding principle that had profound and lasting consequences. Severus poured vast resources into the army. He significantly increased soldiers' pay, a necessary measure to maintain loyalty and attract new recruits in an increasingly strained economy. He granted soldiers the right to marry, a fundamental social change that had implications for their integration into civilian life after service. He also promoted numerous soldiers to positions of authority within the imperial administration, effectively militarizing the government. While these measures secured the loyalty of the legions, they placed an enormous financial burden on the state treasury. The cost of maintaining an ever larger and better compensated army meant that other sectors of the government, and indeed the civilian populace, faced increasing fiscal demands. This created a growing tension between the military, now the undisputed power brokers, and the rest of society, who bore the brunt of supporting them. His administrative policies also reflected a shift towards a more centralized and authoritarian rule. He reduced the power of the Senate, an institution that had once been the co-equal partner of the emperor, further consolidating imperial authority. He also embarked on ambitious building projects in his hometown of Leptis Magna, showcasing the growing importance of the provinces and the waning centrality of Rome itself as the sole cultural and political heart of the empire. While Severus was an effective and strong ruler, successfully defending the frontiers against external threats, his reign laid the groundwork for the instability that would follow. By placing the military at the absolute center of power, he inadvertently invited future legions to elevate their own commanders to the imperial purple, setting the stage for decades of civil strife. Upon his death in 211 AD, Septimius Severus left the empire to his two sons, Caracalla and Geta, urging them to rule together. However, fraternal harmony was not to be. Caracalla, named Lucius Septimius Bassianus, but famously known by his nickname, which referred to a Gaulish hooded tunic he popularized, was a man of impulsive and brutal temperament. He murdered his brother Geta, reportedly in their mother's arms, a mere year after their father's death, thus ensuring sole rule for himself. This act of fratricide sent a chilling message throughout the empire, signaling an emperor who was willing to commit any atrocity to secure his power. Caracalla's reign, from 211 to 217 AD, continued and even intensified many of his father's policies. He was obsessed with military matters, leading campaigns against the Alemanni and the Parthians, often with mixed results. His expenses on the army were extravagant, exacerbating the financial pressures on the state that his father had already initiated. To fund these massive military outlays, Caracalla enacted a truly momentous legal reform in 212 AD, known as the Constitutio Antoniniana, or the Antonine Constitution. This edict granted Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the Roman Empire. Previously, citizenship had been a privileged status, often bestowed upon individuals or communities for specific acts of loyalty or service, or simply inherited by birth from Roman parents. The reasons behind Caracalla's decision are debated by historians. Some argue it was a genuine attempt to universalize Roman identity, to create a more unified empire under a single legal framework. Others, more cynically, suggest it was primarily a fiscal measure. Roman citizens, after all, paid more taxes than non-citizens, particularly inheritance taxes. By expanding the base of citizenship, Caracalla significantly increased the number of taxpayers, providing a much-needed injection of funds into his depleted treasury. While seemingly a progressive move, the Antonine Constitution had complex and far-reaching consequences. It certainly expanded the legal rights and protections for millions of people, bringing them under the full umbrella of Roman law. However, it also diluted the very meaning of Roman citizenship. When everyone was a citizen, the special status and distinct privileges associated with it diminished. The incentive for provincials to strive for citizenship, to assimilate into Roman culture to gain that coveted status, was removed. The unique identity that had once bound Romans together, separating them from the broader mass of provincials, began to blur. Economically, the increased tax revenue was indeed a short-term gain for the imperial coffers, but it was a solution born of desperation, not long-term economic strategy. It did little to address the fundamental issues of a struggling agricultural sector, a debased currency, and an increasingly top-heavy military budget. Caracalla himself became increasingly paranoid and tyrannical, his reign ending abruptly in 217 AD when he was assassinated by a disgruntled Praetorian prefect, Macrinus, who then briefly seized the throne. The assassination of Caracalla heralded a period of rapid succession and further instability within the Severan Dynasty. Macrinus, a man of humble equestrian origin, was the first emperor who had not been a senator before his ascension. His reign was short-lived, as was that of Elagabalus, a flamboyant and controversial teenage emperor who attempted to impose a Syrian sun god cult as the chief deity of Rome. His successor, Severus Alexander, was another young emperor who, despite some efforts at reform, ultimately lacked the strong hand needed to control the increasingly assertive military. His reign ended in 235 AD, when he too was assassinated by his own troops during a campaign on the German frontier. With the death of Severus Alexander, the last of the direct Severan line, the Roman Empire plunged headlong into a half-century of unprecedented crisis. A period so turbulent and chaotic that it became known to history as the crisis of the 3rd century. The foundations laid by Septimius Severus, emphasizing military loyalty at any cost and burdening the state with immense expenses, had ironically paved the way for this coming storm. The illusion of perpetual stability, carefully cultivated during the Pax Romana, was now shattered, replaced by a relentless cycle of civil war, economic collapse, and barbarian incursions. The slow decline, almost imperceptible at first, was about to accelerate dramatically. The year 235 AD marks a stark turning point, a precipice from which the Roman Empire began a tumultuous half-century of chaos, a period rightly christened the crisis of the 3rd century. With the assassination of Severus Alexander, the imperial throne became a prize, not for inherited right or senatorial election, but for military might and brute force. It was an era defined by a dizzying succession of emperors, often chosen by their own legions, elevated to power on a whim, and just as swiftly deposed or murdered when they failed to satisfy the demands of their soldiers. Imagine a world where the very head of state could change several times within a single year, where news of one emperor's ascension would barely reach the distant provinces before reports of his violent demise, and the proclamation of another followed. This was the reality of the Roman Empire between 235 and 284 AD. Over this span of just under 50 years, at least 26 men were officially recognized as Roman emperors. And this count does not even include the multitude of usurpers, the regional strongmen, who briefly held sway over parts of the empire, minting their own coins and issuing their own decrees, only to be crushed by a rival or overthrown by their own restless troops. The phenomenon of the barracks emperors came to define this age. These were often seasoned military commanders, men of formidable presence and proven battlefield experience, but with little or no experience in civil administration or the intricate political maneuvering of the Roman Senate. They were acclaimed by their soldiers on distant frontiers, amidst the dust and clamor of military camps, often after a successful campaign, or simply because they promised better pay and richer spoils. Their legitimacy stemmed not from tradition or the ancient institutions of Rome, but from the raised swords and roaring acclamations of their legions. The problem, of course, was that what the army gave, the army could also take away. Loyalty was fleeting, dependent on continuous largesse and unbroken success. A single military setback, a delayed payment, or even a perceived slight could turn an emperor's most fervent supporters into his executioners. The first of these barracks emperors was Maximinus Thrax, a man of immense physical stature and Thracian peasant stock, who had risen from the ranks to command legions. He was proclaimed emperor by his troops on the German frontier after Severus Alexander was killed. Maximinus never even bothered to visit Rome during his 3-year reign, which lasted from 235 to 238 AD. His focus was entirely military, his treasury drained by constant warfare and the need to placate his soldiers. This set a dangerous precedent. The emperor was no longer a civilian administrator first and a military commander second, but a general, forever campaigning, forever indebted to his army. His brutal pursuit of perceived enemies, and his heavy-handed tax policies ultimately led to his own assassination by his disgruntled troops, who had grown weary of his harsh rule and the relentless demands placed upon them. This pattern repeated itself with chilling regularity. Each new emperor faced the immediate challenge of securing his position against rival claimants and external threats. This meant constant campaigning, which in turn meant even greater demands on the imperial treasury. And with the treasury constantly running dry, the temptation, indeed the perceived necessity, of debasing the coinage became an irresistible expedient. Imagine a small silver coin, perhaps a denarius, resting in your palm, its surface bearing the stern profile of an emperor. In earlier, more prosperous times, this coin would have been nearly pure silver, a tangible symbol of the wealth and stability of Rome. But now, in the relentless grip of the 3rd century crisis, that same coin would feel lighter, perhaps a little rougher, its silver sheen dull and thin, barely concealing the base copper beneath. The Roman state, desperate to pay its soldiers and finance its endless wars, resorted to reducing the precious metal content of its currency. What began as a subtle reduction, perhaps shaving off a small percentage, escalated rapidly. By the mid-3rd century, silver coins often contained as little as 5 to 10% silver, sometimes even less. They were essentially copper blanks, thinly washed in silver to maintain the illusion of value. This practice, known as debasement, had catastrophic consequences for the Roman economy, ushering in an era of rampant hyperinflation. Merchants, farmers, and artisans quickly realized that the imperial coinage was losing its intrinsic value at an alarming rate. Prices for everyday goods began to soar. A loaf of bread, which might have cost a few debased coins in the morning, could demand many more by evening. People lost faith in the currency. Trade, which had been the lifeblood of the empire, became incredibly difficult. Merchants demanded payment in pure silver or gold, or even in goods themselves, rather than accepting the increasingly worthless imperial issues. The intricate web of commerce that had connected the vast Roman world began to unravel. Cities, once vibrant centers of trade and industry, began to empty. Urban populations, dependent on imported food and manufactured goods, found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. Many city dwellers, facing starvation and ruin, abandoned their homes and sought refuge in the countryside, hoping to find sustenance by working the land, or to seek protection from powerful landowners who could offer a degree of security that the distant imperial government no longer could. This flight from the cities marked a profound demographic and economic shift, a retreat from the sophisticated urbanism of the Pax Romana towards a more localized, self-sufficient, and fundamentally less advanced way of life. The imperial government itself struggled with this economic paralysis. Taxes, traditionally collected in coinage, now often had to be demanded in kind. Farmers were forced to hand over a portion of their harvest, artisans their manufactured goods, to supply the legions and the bureaucracy. This system, known as the asterisk annona militaris asterisk, provided some relief, but was cumbersome, inefficient, and deeply unpopular. It further tied individuals to their land or profession, as the state sought to ensure a consistent supply of essential goods and labor, foreshadowing later developments where people would be legally bound to their work. While internal strife and economic collapse gnawed at the core of Rome, external pressures intensified dramatically on every frontier. The relative quiet of the Pax Romana was replaced by a cacophony of barbarian incursions and persistent warfare. In the east, the familiar adversary of the Parthian Empire had been overthrown and replaced by a new, more aggressive and militarily formidable power, the Sassanid Persian Empire. Under their dynamic ruler, Ardashir, and later his son Shapur, the Sassanids launched repeated and devastating invasions into the eastern provinces of Rome, particularly Syria and Mesopotamia. They sacked cities, captured Roman legions, and inflicted humiliating defeats upon imperial armies. In one of the most shocking events of the crisis, Emperor Valerian himself was captured by Shapur the first in 260 AD, dying in Persian captivity, an unprecedented and deeply traumatic blow to Roman prestige and morale. To the north, along the vast stretch of the Rhine and Danube rivers, the Germanic tribes, long held at bay, were now pressing inward with unprecedented force. The Goths, a confederation of Germanic peoples, whose migrations had begun to push them southward, became a particularly destructive force. They crossed the Danube repeatedly, raiding deep into the Balkans and even sailing across the Black Sea to pillage cities in Asia Minor and Greece. The Alemanni, another powerful Germanic group, repeatedly breached the Rhine frontier, raiding into Gaul and Italy, threatening even Rome itself. The Franks, a collection of Germanic tribes in the lower Rhine region, also began their incursions, destabilizing northern Gaul. These were not merely sporadic raids by small bands of warriors. These were often large-scale movements of peoples, driven by their own internal dynamics, population pressures, or the terrifying incursions of other groups like the Huns further to their east. They often numbered in the tens of thousands, equipped and organized enough to challenge Roman legions in open battle. The vast network of Roman frontier fortifications, once so effective, was now proving insufficient against such widespread and coordinated pressure. The legions, already depleted by civil wars and plagues, found themselves desperately overstretched, rushing from one hotspot to another, often arriving too late to prevent widespread devastation. The strategic initiative had passed from Rome to its external enemies. The constant warfare, famine, and recurrent waves of plague continued to decimate the Roman population. The Cyprianic Plague, another devastating epidemic that struck in the mid-3rd century, named after Saint Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage who described its horrors, caused widespread mortality, compounding the demographic decline initiated by the Antonine Plague a century earlier. Villages stood empty, fields lay fallow, and vast tracts of land that had once fed the empire now produced little. This created a vicious cycle. Fewer people meant less agricultural output, which meant less food, which weakened the population, making them more susceptible to disease and less able to resist barbarian incursions. Socially, the crisis led to profound transformations. The once clear distinction between free Roman citizens and various social strata began to blur under the weight of shared hardship. The traditional structures of Roman society, which had valued civic participation and urban life, started to erode. Many small independent farmers, unable to pay their crushing taxes, protect their lands from raiders, or find markets for their goods amidst the economic turmoil, increasingly sought the protection of large, powerful landowners. They would commend themselves and their land to these wealthy magnates, often receiving in return a measure of security and patronage. In exchange, they became semi-free tenant farmers, legally tied to the land they worked, unable to leave without the permission of the landlord. This system, a precursor to medieval serfdom, gradually transformed the social landscape, diminishing the number of free, independent Roman citizens and creating a growing class of dependent peasants. The wealthy elite, particularly the senatorial class, increasingly retreated to their vast, often fortified country estates. These villas became self-sufficient economic units, producing their own food, wine, and even some manufactured goods, often protected by their own private retinues of armed men. While they managed to insulate themselves from some of the worst aspects of the crisis, their withdrawal from public life further weakened the civic fabric of the empire and the central government. The great cities of Rome, once the beating heart of an empire, were becoming dangerous, impoverished, and depopulated places. This was a world in rapid disarray, a tapestry of once vibrant civilization now unraveling thread by thread. The Roman state was not just facing external enemies or economic woes. It was undergoing a fundamental internal transformation, a slow, agonizing metamorphosis driven by a relentless convergence of crises. The illusion of eternal Rome was now thoroughly shattered, replaced by a grim struggle for mere survival, a struggle that would continue to consume the empire for decades to come, before any glimmer of stability could even begin to be re-established. The very idea of an empire, unified and strong, was dissolving, giving way to a fragmented, fractured reality. The very idea of an empire, unified and strong, was dissolving, giving way to a fragmented, fractured reality. Yet, out of the depths of this protracted crisis, a remarkable figure would emerge, a man of immense will and organizational genius who would temporarily pull the sprawling Roman world back from the brink of total collapse. His name was Diocletian, and his ascent to the imperial throne in 284 AD marked the beginning of a profound transformation. An ambitious, even audacious, attempt to stabilize an empire that seemed determined to tear itself apart. Diocletian, born Diocles to a family of humble origins in Dalmatia, a Roman province on the eastern Adriatic coast, was another one of the barracks emperors, having risen through the ranks of the military by dint of his shrewdness, courage, and exceptional administrative abilities. He was proclaimed emperor by his soldiers in Nicomedia, in Asia Minor, following the death of the previous emperor, Numerian. His rise was not without the usual struggle. He swiftly defeated Carinus, Numerian's co-emperor and brother, at the Battle of the Margus in 285 AD, thereby securing sole control of the vast Roman realm. But unlike many of his short-lived predecessors, Diocletian was not content merely to win battles and placate his legions for a few fleeting years. He possessed a far grander vision, to fundamentally restructure the empire, to make it governable once more, to secure its frontiers, and to restore its economic vitality. He understood, perhaps more deeply than anyone before him, that the vastness of the Roman Empire had become its greatest weakness. No single man, however capable, could effectively manage the myriad military threats, administrative complexities, and economic woes that plagued the entire territory, stretching from Britannia to Persia. His solution was radical, unprecedented, and utterly pragmatic: the division of imperial power. Diocletian recognized that trying to rule such an enormous and diverse domain from a single capital, especially one as distant and often besieged as Rome had become, was simply unfeasible. Therefore, he chose to share the burden of governance, not by appointing junior colleagues who might one day usurp him, but by establishing a formal system of shared rule known as the Tetrarchy, literally meaning rule by four. This system was meticulously designed. Initially, in 286 AD, Diocletian appointed a fellow military commander, Maximian, as his co-emperor, and Augustus, entrusting him with the administration of the western half of the empire. Diocletian, retaining the senior position, would oversee the east. This initial diarchy, or rule by two, quickly evolved. In 293 AD, Diocletian further expanded the system by appointing two junior emperors, known as Caesars. Constantius Chlorus was appointed Caesar under Maximian in the west, and Galerius was appointed Caesar under Diocletian in the east. Each of these four emperors was assigned a specific geographical area of responsibility, though their authority was ultimately understood to be unified under the senior Augustus Diocletian. The idea was that each Augustus, supported by his Caesar, would be closer to the pressing military frontiers and administrative centers of their respective regions, allowing for more rapid responses to barbarian incursions and more efficient local governance. This also provided a clear line of succession, as the Caesars were groomed to eventually succeed their Augusti, thereby hoping to prevent the destructive civil wars that had plagued the previous decades. The empire was effectively carved into four large administrative districts, each with its own imperial court and administrative apparatus. Importantly, none of these new imperial capitals were Rome. Diocletian established his primary residence and administrative center in Nicomedia in Bithynia, in the east. Maximian established his court in Mediolanum, modern-day Milan, in northern Italy, a city strategically located to counter Germanic threats. Constantius governed from Augusta Trevarum, modern-day Trier, on the Rhine frontier. while Galerius resided in Sirmium, in the Balkans, closer to the critical Danube frontier. The ancient city of Rome, while retaining its symbolic importance, became largely a ceremonial capital. Its political power diminished in favor of these new strategically vital centers. This administrative overhaul went far beyond the Tetrarchy itself. Diocletian embarked upon a comprehensive restructuring of the entire Roman governmental framework. He recognized that the existing provincial divisions were often too large and unwieldy, making them difficult to govern and susceptible to the accumulation of excessive power by individual governors. Therefore, he dramatically increased the number of provinces, effectively subdividing the larger ones into smaller, more manageable units. These new, smaller provinces were then grouped into larger administrative units called dioceses, each overseen by an asterisk vicaris asterisk, an official answerable directly to the emperors. The dioceses, in turn, were grouped into 4 praetorian prefectures, each corresponding to one of the tetrarch's domains. This meticulous hierarchy was designed to decentralize administration in some ways, allowing for closer oversight, while simultaneously centralizing ultimate authority in the hands of the 4 emperors. It also created a clearer separation between civil and military authority. Governors were now primarily civil officials, while military commanders, or asterisk deuces asterisk, were responsible for the troops in their region, preventing individual officials from accumulating too much power and potentially instigating rebellion. This separation of powers was a crucial attempt to prevent the barracks emperors phenomenon from recurring. Diocletian also undertook monumental efforts to reform the shattered Roman economy. The rampant debasement of the currency and the hyperinflation of the 3rd century had left the imperial finances in ruins. He attempted to stabilize the currency by issuing new, more intrinsically valuable gold and silver coins, notably the asterisk solidus asterisk, a precursor to Constantine's later gold coin of the same name, and the asterisk argentius asterisk. However, these attempts were met with mixed success. People, having been burned so many times by worthless coinage, were often reluctant to trust the new issues, hoarding the precious metal coins and using the still debased copper ones for daily transactions, perpetuating the inflationary pressures. His most ambitious and ultimately most controversial economic measure was the Edict on Maximum Prices, issued in 301 AD. This sweeping edict attempted to fix the prices of thousands of goods and services across the entire empire, from a bushel of wheat to the wages of a stonemason. It also set maximum prices for transport, clothing, and even the fees for lawyers and teachers. The intention was to curb inflation and ensure fair prices for consumers and soldiers alike. However, the edict proved to be an administrative nightmare and an economic disaster. It was impossible to enforce across such a vast and diverse economy. Merchants, faced with artificially low prices, often resorted to hoarding goods, selling them on the black market, or simply refusing to sell them at all. The edict led to widespread shortages, further disrupting trade and contributing to economic stagnation rather than alleviating it. Despite the harsh penalties for violation, including death, the edict ultimately failed and was largely ignored, a testament to the futility of trying to control market forces through imperial decree alone. To ensure a stable tax base for his massive army and bureaucracy, Diocletian also implemented a new and highly systematized tax reform. This involved a comprehensive census of the entire empire, measuring both land and human labor. Taxes were assessed based on units of land, or the asterisk capita jugum asterisk system, calculated according to their productivity, and units of human labor available to work that land. This system aimed to make taxation more equitable and predictable, ensuring a steady flow of revenue. However, it also led to an unprecedented level of state control and bureaucracy, effectively binding farmers and their descendants to their ancestral lands to ensure tax collection and agricultural production. This further solidified the asterisk colony asterisk system, making it a permanent fixture of the late Roman social and economic landscape, deepening the trajectory towards serfdom we noted earlier. Diocletian's reforms were monumental in scope and ambition. They arrested the immediate political disintegration of the empire and provided a much-needed period of administrative stability. He restored a sense of order and imperial authority after decades of chaos. However, these reforms came at a significant cost. They transformed the Roman Empire into a more authoritarian, bureaucratic, and militarized state. The traditional Roman ideal of a citizen republic, however distant that ideal had become, was now irrevocably replaced by a vast imperial machine, demanding strict obedience and total devotion from its subjects. The seeds of medieval government and society, with its rigid social structures and localized economies, were firmly sown during this era. Yet, even as he restructured the empire, Diocletian sought to restore what he perceived as its traditional values, a pursuit that would lead him to launch one of the most brutal and widespread persecutions in Roman history, aimed squarely at the burgeoning community of Christians. This religious fervor, however, would prove to be a force far more resilient than he could have ever imagined. Diocletian, a man deeply rooted in traditional Roman polytheism and a staunch believer in the necessity of imperial unity, saw the rapidly growing Christian community as a profound threat to the very fabric of his meticulously reconstructed empire. To him, the Christians' refusal to participate in the state cult, to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods, and to worship the emperor himself, was not merely a matter of theological difference. It was an act of sedition, a challenge to imperial authority, and a dangerous undermining of the ancient Roman pietas, the reverence for gods, family, and state, which he believed was essential for Rome's stability and well-being. For decades, Christians had faced intermittent, localized persecutions. But under Diocletian, this would escalate into something far more systematic and terrifying. A final, desperate attempt to stamp out this burgeoning monotheistic religion. Beginning in 303 AD, a series of imperial edicts were issued, initiating what history would remember as the Great Persecution. These edicts were carefully designed, starting with measures that might seem mild to the Roman mind, but were devastating to Christians, and progressively becoming more severe. The first edict, issued in February 303 AD, ordered the destruction of Christian churches across the empire, the burning of their sacred scriptures, and the confiscation of their property. Christians holding positions of honor or rank were stripped of their offices, and those of lower status were deprived of their legal rights. Imagine the sudden shock and terror that rippled through Christian communities as their places of worship, often modest but deeply cherished, were torn down, and their precious scrolls, the very words of their faith, were consigned to flames. This initial wave sought to dismantle the organizational structure of the church and deprive its adherents of their spiritual nourishment. A second edict followed shortly thereafter, ordering the imprisonment of all Christian clergy. The jails, already often overcrowded, became filled with bishops, priests, deacons, and other ministers. This aimed to decapitate the leadership of the Christian community, believing that without their spiritual guides, the flock would scatter and eventually return to traditional Roman religious practices. But the persecution did not stop there. A third edict demanded that all imprisoned clergy offer sacrifices to the Roman gods to secure their release. Those who refused faced brutal torture or execution. This was a direct assault on the core tenets of Christianity, which forbade the worship of any god other than their own, and certainly the offering of sacrifices to pagan deities. For many, this choice between apostasy and agonizing death was an unbearable test of faith. The final and most comprehensive edict of the Great Persecution was issued in 304 AD. It commanded that all inhabitants of the empire, without exception, perform a public sacrifice to the Roman gods and consume sacrificial meat and wine. Certificates were issued to those who complied, proving their allegiance to the traditional state religion. Failure to obtain such a certificate meant certain death. This move, perhaps the most far-reaching in its intent, aimed to force every single Christian to renounce their faith publicly or face the ultimate penalty. The intensity and duration of the Great Persecution varied significantly across the empire. In the western provinces, under the relatively lenient rule of Constantius Chlorus, the persecution was often half-hearted and short-lived, sometimes limited to the destruction of churches without significant loss of life. But in the east, under Diocletian himself and particularly under his fiercely pagan Caesar, Galerius, the persecution was relentless and brutal. Here, Christians faced the full force of imperial wrath. They were arrested, tortured in horrific ways, stretched on racks, burned with hot irons, thrown to wild beasts in the amphitheaters, and executed en masse. Entire towns were forced to participate in pagan sacrifices. Stories of martyrs, individuals who steadfastly refused to recant their faith even in the face of unimaginable suffering, spread through Christian communities, inspiring some while terrifying others. Diocletian and Galerius genuinely believed that this overwhelming assault would finally extinguish Christianity. They envisioned a purified empire, united once more under the traditional Roman gods, whose favor they believed was essential for imperial success. However, their efforts ultimately backfired. Instead of destroying Christianity, the persecution, in a perverse way, strengthened it. The courage and unwavering conviction of the martyrs became powerful testaments to the truth and resilience of their faith. The sight of ordinary men and women enduring unimaginable torment for their beliefs left a deep impression, even on many pagans. Rather than fading, the Christian communities, though certainly diminished in numbers by death and apostasy, often grew in spiritual resolve and solidarity. Their underground networks, owned by decades of intermittent persecution, allowed them to maintain communication and support. Eventually, in 311 AD, Galerius, one of the most zealous persecutors, issued an edict of toleration from his deathbed. Racked by a terrible illness, he perhaps saw divine retribution in his suffering. This edict formally ended the Great Persecution, granting Christians the right to practice their religion, provided they did nothing to disturb the public order. This was a stunning reversal, a tacit admission by the imperial state that its grand effort to eradicate Christianity had failed. The stage was now set for an even more dramatic turn of events: the grand design of the Tetrarchy. Diocletian's brilliant but ultimately fragile system of shared rule was already beginning to unravel even before the persecution fully ended. Diocletian himself, in a truly unprecedented act for a Roman emperor, voluntarily abdicated his throne in 305 AD, compelling his co-Augustus, Maximian, to do the same. This was meant to ensure a smooth transition of power to the Caesars, Constantius Chlorus and Galerius, who would then become the new Augusti, in turn appointing their own Caesars. However, the Second Tetrarchy quickly proved far less stable than the first. Personal ambitions, rivalries, and the inherent stresses of shared power swiftly resurfaced. When Constantius Chlorus, the Augustus in the west, died unexpectedly in York, Britannia, in 306 AD, his troops immediately acclaimed his son, Constantine, as their new Augustus. This act directly violated the established Tetrarchic succession plan, which stipulated that the Caesar Severus should have succeeded Constantius. Simultaneously, in Rome, Maximian's son, Maxentus, who had been excluded from the succession, also declared himself emperor with the support of the Praetorian Guard and the Roman populace. The carefully constructed edifice of the Tetrarchy crumbled into another devastating cycle of civil wars, reminiscent of the chaotic 3rd century. Amidst this renewed turmoil, the figure of Constantine emerged as a dominant force. Born in Naissus, modern-day Nice in Serbia, in approximately 272 AD, Constantine was the son of Constantius Chlorus and Helena, a woman of humble origins who would later become Saint Helena. He was a seasoned military commander, having served with distinction under Diocletian and Galerius, observing firsthand the strengths and weaknesses of the Tetrarchic system and the futility of the Christian persecutions. His path to sole power was arduous, marked by a series of decisive military campaigns against his rivals. One of the most pivotal of these conflicts was his confrontation with Maxentius, who controlled Italy and North Africa. The armies of Constantine and Maxentius met in a decisive clash near the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome, in October 312 AD. What transpired before and during this battle would forever alter the course of not just Roman history, but world history. According to contemporary accounts, most famously that of the Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea, Constantine experienced a profound vision or dream on the eve of the battle. While the exact details vary, the essence remains consistent. Constantine saw a symbol in the sky, often described as the chi rho, the first two Greek letters of Christ or a cross. He reportedly heard a voice or understood a divine message, instructing him to conquer in this sign. Taking this as a divine omen, he ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol on their shields. The ensuing Battle of the Milvian Bridge was a resounding victory for Constantine. Maxentius' forces were routed, and Maxentius himself drowned in the Tiber River. Constantine's victory was widely interpreted by himself and by a rapidly growing number of Christians as a divine endorsement of the Christian God. This single event marked a dramatic shift in imperial policy towards Christianity. The very next year, in 313 AD, Constantine, along with his co-emperor in the east, Licinius, issued the Edict of Milan. This groundbreaking decree went beyond Galerius' earlier Edict of Toleration. It formally granted religious freedom to all citizens of the Roman Empire, effectively legalizing Christianity and restoring all confiscated Christian property. Crucially, it did not just tolerate Christianity. It placed it on an equal footing with other religions within the empire, a move that was truly revolutionary. The edict stated, "We should grant to the Christians and others full authority to observe that religion which each preferred." This pronouncement, flowing from the highest imperial authority, ended centuries of official hostility towards Christianity and inaugurated a new era of religious pluralism, or at least the promise of it. For Constantine, this was more than just a political maneuver. It was a genuine, albeit evolving, spiritual transformation. He began to favor Christianity, showering the church with imperial patronage, building magnificent basilicas, and granting privileges to clergy. While he did not make Christianity the sole state religion overnight, indeed, he maintained some pagan titles and symbols throughout his reign. Navigating a complex religious landscape, his personal inclination and public support unequivocally signaled a new imperial direction. The once persecuted faith was now on the fast track to becoming the dominant religion of the Roman world. With the Edict of Milan, the immediate threat of persecution vanished, and Christians could now practice their faith openly. The Church, previously an underground and often fragmented organization, began to grow rapidly in numbers, wealth, and influence. This new imperial patronage, however, also brought its own set of challenges, as the Church now had to contend with internal doctrinal disputes escalating into imperial affairs, and the complexities of managing a rapidly expanding and increasingly powerful institution within the state. Constantine, still having to contend with rivals for ultimate power, especially Licinius, eventually became the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire after defeating Licinius in 324 AD. Now, as the undisputed Augustus, he set about further cementing his vision for a renewed Rome. One of his most enduring and symbolic acts was the founding of a new imperial capital. He chose the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, strategically located at the crossroads of Europe and Asia on the Bosphorus Strait. Here, he embarked on an ambitious building program, transforming the small city into a magnificent new metropolis, which he dedicated in 330 AD as Nova Roma, or New Rome. It would soon become known by his own name, Constantinople. The founding of Constantinople was a profoundly symbolic act, more than just a practical shift in administrative center. It was a Christian city in its ambition and design, intended to reflect the new religious identity of the empire. While it did not immediately erase all vestiges of paganism, its new civic spaces and grand churches, including an early structure on the site where the great Hagia Sophia would later stand, marked a clear spiritual direction. This new capital was far from the vulnerable western frontiers and the increasingly decadent heartland of Italy. It was strategically positioned to command the rich resources of the east and to better respond to threats from the Persian Empire and the tribes along the Danube. This shift of the capital had enormous long-term implications. It created two distinct centers of gravity within the empire: the old, Latin-speaking West, centered on Rome, gradually losing its economic and political vitality, and the new, Greek-speaking East, centered on Constantinople, which would flourish and endure for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. The stage was now set for an increasingly divergent future for the two halves of what was still nominally a single Roman empire. The political and religious landscape of the Roman world had been fundamentally reshaped, but the underlying tensions and structural weaknesses that had led to the crisis of the 3rd century were far from resolved. The process of slow decline, temporarily masked by Constantine's impressive reforms and victories, would continue, albeit along new and increasingly separate trajectories for East and West. The process of slow decline, temporarily masked by the impressive reforms and victories of Constantine, would continue, albeit along new and increasingly separate trajectories for East and West. The unity that Constantine had painstakingly re-established after the chaos of the Tetrarchy and the subsequent civil wars proved to be a fragile and temporary construct. After his death in 337 AD, the empire was once again divided among his sons, Constantius II, Constantine II, and Constans, leading to further internal conflicts and a period of shifting alliances and rivalries that continued to drain Roman resources and manpower. The underlying structural weaknesses of the empire, particularly in the West, persisted despite the efforts of Constantine. The economic disparities between the richer, more populous East and the increasingly strained, less urbanized West continued to grow. The administrative burdens, the heavy taxation, and the constant need to fund a vast military remained immense. And always beyond the frontiers, the barbarian tribes continued to gather, their pressure on the Roman borders a relentless, gnawing force. After the sons of Constantine, a brief but significant interlude occurred with the reign of Julian, often called Julian the Apostate. Ruling from 361 to 363 AD, Julian attempted a deliberate, albeit ultimately futile, reversal of the Christianizing policies of Constantine. A deeply intellectual and philosophical emperor, he sought to revive traditional Roman paganism, issuing edicts that promoted the old gods and restricted Christian influence, particularly in education. The reign of Julian was a final, desperate flicker of the ancient Roman religious order, a brief attempt to turn back the theological tide. However, his efforts were cut short by the death of Julian during a campaign against the Sassanid Persians, and his successors swiftly reinstated and even strengthened Christian policy. His brief reign only served to highlight how deeply Christianity had already permeated the fabric of the empire, especially among the common people, making any full return to paganism practically impossible. Following Julian, emperors like Valentinian I in the west and Valens in the east struggled valiantly to shore up the crumbling frontiers and maintain order. Valentinian was a strong military emperor, tirelessly working to defend the Rhine and Danube, while Valens bore the heavy responsibility of the eastern frontier against the resurgent Persians, all while the Goths began to stir menacingly. It was during the reign of these emperors that a profound and utterly unforeseen movement of peoples began to unfold far to the east, a movement that would send shockwaves across the entire Eurasian continent and deliver a truly devastating blow to the Western Roman Empire. This immense shift was precipitated by the arrival of the Huns. Imagine a vast nomadic confederation of fierce horse archers. Originating from the steppes of Central Asia, their reputation for ferocity preceding them like a terrifying shadow. Their sudden and violent push westward in the latter half of the 4th century caused a domino effect, dislodging numerous Germanic tribes from their ancestral lands. Faced with the unstoppable advance of the Huns, these tribes, particularly the powerful Gothic groups known as the Thervingi, found themselves with a desperate choice: stand and be annihilated, or seek refuge within the very Roman Empire they had long warred against. In 376 AD, a pivotal moment occurred when a massive contingent of these Goths, numbering perhaps in the tens of thousands, including warriors, women, children, and their livestock, appeared on the northern bank of the Danube River, gazing across the murky waters into Roman territory. They pleaded with the Roman Emperor Valens, who ruled the east, for permission to cross the river and settle within the empire. They promised to serve as loyal federates, to provide soldiers for the Roman army, and to adopt Roman customs. If only they could be granted sanctuary from the terrifying Huns. Valens, after some deliberation, and swayed by the prospect of a large pool of recruits for his perpetually understaffed army, granted their request. However, the subsequent Roman management of this enormous migration proved to be a catastrophic failure, a bureaucratic and logistical nightmare. The Goths were starved, exploited, and subjected to appalling treatment by corrupt Roman officials. The promises made to them were broken. They were denied food, forced to sell their children into slavery for meager provisions, and treated not as allies, but as a subjugated, disposable population. This systematic abuse eventually ignited a furious rebellion among the Goths. Enraged by their mistreatment, they rose up against their Roman overlords, unleashing a wave of devastation across the Balkans. The Roman authorities, initially underestimating the strength and determination of the Gothic warriors, struggled to contain the uprising. The conflict culminated in one of the most decisive and devastating military defeats in Roman history, the Battle of Adrianople, fought on August 9, 378 AD. Emperor Valens, eager for a personal victory, and perhaps rashly confident, marched the army of Valens, composed primarily of elite field legions from the east, to confront the Gothic forces near the city of Adrianople in modern-day Turkey. He did so without waiting for reinforcements from his western counterpart, Emperor Gratian, a critical tactical error. The battle itself was a brutal, swirling melee. The Goths, under their skilled leader Fritigern, inflicted a crushing defeat upon the Roman army. The Roman heavy infantry, once the undisputed masters of the battlefield, were surrounded and annihilated by the mobility and ferocity of the Gothic cavalry. Emperor Valens, along with a significant portion of his army, including many high-ranking officers, perished in the carnage. His body was never recovered. The Battle of Adrianople was more than just a military defeat. It was a profound psychological and strategic shock to the entire Roman world. It demonstrated, with horrifying clarity, that the Roman army was no longer invincible. It showed that barbarian forces, when properly led and sufficiently motivated, could not only defeat, but utterly destroy a major Roman field army and kill a reigning emperor. The loss of manpower was immense, particularly among the experienced veterans, and the morale of the surviving legions was shattered. The Goths, now emboldened and largely unchecked, continued to ravage the Balkan provinces. Their presence within the empire, a stark and persistent reminder of the vulnerability of Rome. The frontier was no longer an impregnable barrier, but a porous membrane. In the aftermath of this catastrophe, the task of restoring order fell to a new emperor, Theodosius, who was appointed Augustus of the East by Gratian in 379 AD. Theodosius, a Spanish general of considerable military skill, faced the daunting challenge of pacifying the Goths and rebuilding the shattered Roman army. He adopted a strategy of diplomacy and appeasement, rather than direct military confrontation. In 382 AD, he concluded a treaty with the Goths, allowing them to settle within the empire as *foederati*, or federates. This meant they were autonomous allies, permitted to live under their own laws and leaders within Roman territory, in exchange for providing military service to Rome. While this treaty provided a temporary solution and secured much-needed manpower for the Roman army, it also represented a significant departure from traditional Roman policy. Rather than integrating conquered peoples, Rome was now allowing large, armed, ethnically distinct groups to reside within its borders, maintaining their separate identities. This created a state within a state, a potentially volatile situation that would have long-term consequences, particularly for the Western Empire. The Goths, though nominally allies, remained a formidable and often restless presence. Beyond his military and diplomatic endeavors, Theodosius I, often known as Theodosius the Great, is perhaps most famously remembered for his decisive role in shaping the religious future of the Roman Empire. Where Constantine had legalized Christianity and favored it, Theodosius took the momentous step of making Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. This dramatic shift was codified in a series of imperial decrees, most notably the Edict of Thessalonica, issued in 380 AD. This edict, signed by Theodosius Gratian and Valentinian II, declared that all Roman subjects must adhere to the Nicene Creed, the orthodox Christian belief regarding the Trinity, effectively making it illegal to practice other forms of Christianity, such as Arianism or traditional pagan cults. The edict stated, "It is our desire that all the various nations which are subject to our clemency and moderation should continue to profess that religion which was delivered to the Romans by the divine apostle Peter... We authorize the followers of this law to assume the title of Catholic Christians. But as for the others, since, in our judgment, they are foolish madmen, we decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics, and shall not presume to give to their conventicles the name of churches." This was a profound and aggressive assertion of Christian orthodoxy. It began a period where pagan practices were increasingly suppressed, their temples closed, and their rituals forbidden. While the complete eradication of paganism would take time, the policies of Theodosius signaled the unequivocal triumph of Christianity as the dominant and officially sanctioned religion of the Roman state. The religious landscape had been entirely transformed, a far cry from the persecutions of Diocletian just decades earlier. The empire, which had once persecuted Christians, was now persecuting pagans and Christian heretics. However, the most significant, and indeed irreversible, act of the reign of Theodosius came at its very end. Upon his death in 395 AD, Theodosius bequeathed the vast Roman Empire to his two young sons. Arcadius, the elder, was given the east, and Honorius, the younger, was given the west. This was not initially intended as a permanent split of the empire. Previous emperors had often divided administrative responsibilities among family members, but in practice, this division proved to be definitive and enduring. Never again would the Roman Empire be governed by a single, unified imperial administration. The split was not merely geographical. It represented a deeper cultural and political divergence that had been growing for centuries. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, was largely Greek-speaking, more urbanized, wealthier, and possessed a more robust economy. Its administrative structure was more centralized, and its frontiers, though threatened by Persia and the Danube tribes, were generally more manageable. The Western Roman Empire, on the other hand, was Latin-speaking, less urbanized, economically weaker, and its vast frontiers were under constant, relentless pressure from numerous barbarian groups. Its central government in places like Ravenna or Milan often struggled to exert real control over distant provinces. This division formalized the diverging fates of the two halves. The East, soon to be known as the Byzantine Empire, would prove remarkably resilient, adapting to new challenges and enduring for another 1,000 years. The West, however, now isolated and with its own diminishing resources, would face the full, unremitting fury of the barbarian migrations, often with little effective aid from its eastern counterpart. The official end of unified rule in 395 AD was not a dramatic collapse, but it was an administrative sundering that sealed the fate of the Western Empire, leaving it vulnerable to the storms that were rapidly gathering on its horizons. The long, drawn-out process of decline had entered its final, most painful, and ultimately irreversible phase in the West. The long, drawn-out process of decline had entered its final, most painful, and ultimately irreversible phase in the West. With the formal division of the empire in 395 AD, the western half found itself increasingly isolated, vulnerable, and bereft of the richer resources and greater resilience of its eastern counterpart. The court of the Western Empire, under the young and often ineffective Emperor Honorius, soon moved from Milan to the more defensible city of Ravenna, nestled amongst coastal marshes, a strategic retreat that symbolized the increasing fragility of the imperial center. The Goths, whom Theodosius had settled as federates in the Balkans after Adrianople, remained a formidable and restless presence. They were, in essence, a powerful military force operating largely independently within Roman territory. Their relationship with the imperial government, a perpetual source of tension and negotiation. Under their dynamic leader, Alaric, the Visigoths, as they would come to be known, grew increasingly dissatisfied with the terms of their settlement. They felt exploited, denied the promised lands and provisions, and perpetually relegated to secondary roles despite their military strength. Alaric was a figure of complex motivation, a barbarian chieftain who understood the Roman system intimately, not as an outsider but as someone who had grown up within its sphere of influence, fighting for and against its armies. He sought not to destroy Rome, but to carve out a secure and prosperous place for his people within its vast dominion, preferably with official recognition and substantial subsidies. His demands, however, were often seen by the Roman court as audacious and unacceptable, leading to a dangerous cycle of negotiation, broken promises, and renewed hostilities. For many years, the Western Empire was largely defended by one of its last great generals, a man named Stilicho. Of Vandal descent himself, Stilicho was a magister militum a master of soldiers, and a close relative by marriage to the imperial family, having married Serena, the niece of Emperor Theodosius I. He served as the guardian of the young Emperor Honorius and effectively held the reins of power in the West. Stilicho was a brilliant military commander, tirelessly campaigning against barbarian incursions, often with remarkable success. He managed to repel Alaric from Italy on several occasions, notably at Polenia in 402 AD and Verona in 403 AD, and also fought off incursions by other Germanic groups, such as the Goths under Radagaisus, whose invasion of Italy he decisively crushed at Faesulae in 406 AD. The genius of Stilicho, however, was perpetually hampered by the suspicions of the imperial court in Ravenna and the jealousies of powerful Roman senators, who resented his barbarian origins and his immense influence. His political position was precarious, constantly navigating the treacherous currents of court intrigue and xenophobia. He often had to juggle the conflicting demands of the eastern and western courts, and balance the need for barbarian federates with the deep-seated Roman prejudice against them. But even the military prowess of Stilicho could not stem the tide of all external pressures, particularly after a series of increasingly cold winters in the early 5th century potentially froze the mighty Rhine River. On the night of December 31, 406 AD, an event of truly catastrophic significance unfolded on the northwestern frontier of Rome. A massive confederation of Germanic tribes, the Vandals, the Suebi, and the Alans, crossed the frozen Rhine River, effectively breaching one of the most vital and long-standing borders of the empire. Imagine the bitter cold of that winter night, the crunch of ice and snow underfoot, as tens of thousands of people, not just warriors, but entire families with their few possessions, poured across the river, leaving behind their ancestral lands and entering the fertile, but now largely undefended, Roman province of Gaul. This was not a raid. It was a mass migration, an unstoppable flood of humanity seeking new homes and opportunities within the perceived safety, or at least the richness, of the empire. The small number of Roman troops stationed along the Rhine, many of whom were themselves of Germanic origin, were simply overwhelmed. They could not stem this vast human tide. The consequences of this Rhine crossing were immediate and devastating. Gaul, one of the wealthiest and most Romanized provinces, was plunged into chaos. Cities were sacked, villas were plundered, and the intricate Roman administrative network collapsed under the weight of the invasions. The Vandals, Suebi, and Alans moved with relative freedom across the landscape, establishing themselves in various regions, effectively severing the control of Rome over vast swaths of its Western European territories. This catastrophe in Gaul had a ripple effect that extended all the way to the distant island of Britannia. With the Rhine frontier shattered and Gaul overrun, the remaining Roman legions in Britain were increasingly isolated and desperately needed elsewhere. The local Romano-British population, already accustomed to defending themselves against Pictish and Irish raids, found themselves effectively abandoned by the central government. In 410 AD, Emperor Honorius famously sent a letter to the cities of Britain, instructing them to look to their own defense. This informal withdrawal marked the effective end of Roman rule in Britain, an island that had been part of the empire for nearly 4 centuries. It was not a formal decree of abandonment, but a pragmatic acknowledgement of the inability of Rome to project power to its furthest reaches any longer. The island would soon enter a period of profound transformation, giving rise to new kingdoms and traditions. Meanwhile, in Italy, the political maneuvering against Stilicho reached its culmination. Despite his continued military successes against barbarian threats, his perceived pro-barbarian policies and his immense power fueled a growing faction of xenophobic Roman courtiers. In 408 AD, these rivals, led by the imperial secretary Olympius, convinced Emperor Honorius to order the execution of Stilicho. Stilicho, ever loyal to the empire he had served so faithfully, submitted to his fate. His death removed the last truly effective military commander from the Western Roman Empire, leaving a vacuum of leadership at the most critical juncture. With Stilicho gone, the path to Italy was wide open for Alaric and his Visigoths. Alaric, having previously been bought off or repelled by Stilicho, now saw his opportunity. He marched his forces southward, down the long, ancient roads of Italy, past fields and villas, toward the heart of the empire itself. His objective was not wanton destruction, but political leverage. He wanted land, provisions, and official recognition for his people. He desired a secure place for them to settle, a permanent home within the Roman world. In 408 AD, Alaric laid siege to Rome itself. The Eternal City, which had not seen a hostile barbarian army at its gates for almost 8 centuries. Since the Gauls in 387 BC now faced starvation, the aqueducts, lifelines of the great metropolis, were cut. Disease and famine began to ravage the inhabitants. The Roman Senate, in desperation, sent envoys to negotiate with Alaric, who demanded an exorbitant ransom of gold, silver, silk, and pepper. After a period of agonizing negotiations and immense concessions, Alaric lifted the siege. But the relief was temporary. Emperor Honorius, safe in the marshes of Ravenna, remained stubbornly unwilling to grant Alaric the permanent land settlements he truly desired. He offered insufficient concessions, and negotiations repeatedly broke down. This intransigence, coupled with a deep distrust of barbarian intentions, sealed the fate of Rome. In 410 AD, after further fruitless negotiations and a second, shorter siege, Alaric once again marched on Rome. This time, a gate, perhaps the Salarian Gate, was opened from within the city, whether by design or by desperation. On August 24th, 410 AD, the Visigoths entered Rome. Imagine the quiet terror that must have descended upon the city in those moments. The sounds of barbarian warriors moving through the ancient streets, their shouts echoing off the walls of venerable buildings. For 3 days, the Visigoths systematically plundered Rome. They looted the palaces of the wealthy, stripped the temples of their treasures, and carried away untold riches. While undoubtedly a traumatic event for the inhabitants, historical accounts, particularly those from Christian sources, suggest that the sack was relatively disciplined, at least compared to what later barbarian incursions might inflict. Churches were generally spared, and there was not the wholesale slaughter or burning that characterized some sieges. Alaric was a Christian, albeit an Arian Christian, and his reverence for the sanctity of holy places, and indeed for the city of Rome itself, influenced his actions. Nevertheless, the sack of Rome in 410 AD was an event of cataclysmic symbolic significance. It shattered the illusion of the invincibility of Rome, sending shockwaves across the entire Roman world and beyond. For over 8 centuries, Rome had stood unviolated by foreign enemies. It was the eternal city, the very embodiment of imperial power and divine protection. Its fall, however limited in its physical destruction, was an unimaginable blow to Roman prestige and morale. It was proof, for many, that the old ways had failed, that the gods had abandoned Rome, or that the empire was indeed crumbling. News of the sack resonated deeply throughout the empire. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, famously lamented, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Augustine of Hippo, the great Christian theologian, felt compelled to write his monumental work, The City of God, in response to the pagan accusations that Christianity was to blame for the fall of Rome. He argued that the true city of God was not an earthly kingdom, but a spiritual one, thereby offering a profound reinterpretation of history and human destiny in the wake of such imperial calamity. The Visigoths, having plundered Rome, did not linger. Alaric led his people south, with intentions perhaps of crossing to North Africa, but he died shortly thereafter in Bruttium. His successor, Ataulf, eventually led the Visigoths out of Italy and into Gaul, where they would eventually establish a kingdom, continuing their complex dance of alliance and antagonism with the Western Roman authorities. The sack of Rome did not mark the actual end of the Western Roman Empire. The empire would hobble on for another 66 years, but it irrevocably altered the psychological landscape. The unthinkable had happened. The heart of the empire had been violated. The event served as a stark and undeniable testament to the terminal decline of Roman power in the West, ushering in an era where the empire was no longer the sole, undisputed power, but one among many competing forces in a rapidly changing European landscape. The control of critical resources, particularly the vital grain supply from North Africa, would soon become a central and desperate struggle for the beleaguered Western Roman state. The control of critical resources, particularly the vital grain supply from North Africa, would soon become a central and desperate struggle for the beleaguered Western Roman state. Indeed, even as the Visigoths moved through Gaul, another formidable Germanic group, the Vandals, were carving out their own destiny, one that would deliver a truly crippling blow to the Western Empire. Remember the crossing of the Rhine on that freezing New Year's Eve of 406 AD. The Vandals were part of that massive barbarian confederation that poured into Gaul, ravaging the province for several years. From Gaul, under pressure from the Visigoths and the Franks, they continued their relentless westward and southward migration. By 409 AD, they, along with their allies the Suebi and Alans, had crossed the Pyrenees Mountains and entered Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula. Here, they established various kingdoms, further fragmenting Roman control over one of its key provinces. For almost 20 years, the Vandals consolidated their power in parts of Hispania, occasionally clashing with Roman forces or other barbarian groups already settled there. However, their ambitious leader, Gaiseric, a man of cunning intelligence and ruthless determination, harbored grander designs. They saw an opportunity across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar, in the rich and strategically vital Romang provinces of North Africa. In 429 AD, Gaiseric led his entire people, estimated to be around 80,000 souls, across the Strait of Gibraltar from Hispania into Romang, North Africa. This was another immense migration, reminiscent of the Goths crossing the Danube, but perhaps even more consequential. North Africa was the breadbasket of Rome, the primary source of grain that fed the populace of the city of Rome and sustained the armies in Italy. Its rich agricultural lands and bustling ports represented immense wealth and strategic importance. The Vandals, once across, moved rapidly and with devastating effect. They were not seeking integration as federates, as the Goths had initially. Gaiseric intended to establish a fully independent Vandal kingdom, a power that would rival Rome itself. The Roman provincial forces in North Africa were ill-prepared and swiftly overwhelmed. City after city fell to the Vandal advance. The Roman general Bonifacius, who initially opposed them, found himself caught between the Vandals and the increasingly suspicious imperial court in Ravenna, eventually being recalled to Italy and dying in a civil war. By 439 D, Gaiseric and his Vandals captured Carthage, the crown jewel of Roman North Africa. This city, once Rome's ancient rival and later one of its most prosperous centers, became the capital of the new Vandal kingdom. With the fall of Carthage, the Vandals gained control of the entire North African coast, along with its invaluable harbors and its vast grain fields. This was a true catastrophe for the Western Romang Empire. Imagine the shock and despair in Rome and Ravenna as the news filtered in. The loss of North Africa meant the immediate cessation of the regular grain shipments that sustained the very capital of the empire. The city of Rome, which relied almost entirely on imported grain, faced the specter of perpetual famine. Its population, already dwindling, would now experience severe food shortages, leading to widespread misery, unrest, and further depopulation. The imperial treasury, already strained, also lost the immense tax revenues from these rich provinces. The Vandal capture of North Africa was not merely a territorial loss. It was an economic strangulation, a direct blow to the ability of Rome to feed itself and fund its remaining armies. But Gaiseric was not content with merely holding North Africa. With the expertise of the captured Roman shipyards and the control of crucial ports, the Vandals rapidly built a powerful fleet. They became a formidable naval power, the first barbarian kingdom to truly master the seas of the Mediterranean. From their North African base, the Vandal fleet launched devastating raids across the Mediterranean, plundering coastal cities in Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and even Italy itself. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now contested territory, its shores vulnerable to Vandal pirate attacks. This naval dominance allowed Gaiseric to exert immense pressure on Rome, often using blockades and threats to extract tribute and concessions. As if the Vandal threat were not enough, another terrifying shadow fell across Europe in the mid-5th century: Attila the Hun. The Huns, whose westward migration had initially dislodged the Goths, had by now established a vast and fearsome empire, stretching from the Volga River to the Rhine. Under the leadership of Attila, a legendary warrior and tactician who ruled from 434 to 453 AD, the Huns became the scourge of God, their name alone striking terror into the hearts of Romans and barbarians alike. Attila was a master of psychological warfare and strategic intimidation. His highly mobile cavalry forces, renowned for their swiftness and brutal efficiency, seemed unstoppable. His strategy was often to extract vast tributes from both the Western and Eastern Roman empires, threatening devastating invasions if his demands were not met. For years, the Eastern Empire, with its greater wealth, largely bought him off, redirecting his attention towards the West. In 451 AD, Attila finally turned his gaze fully upon the Western Roman Empire. He led a massive confederation of Huns and their various Germanic subject tribes, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, and others into Gaul. His stated reason was a flimsy claim to the hand of Honoria, Emperor Valentinian III's sister, and half of the Western Empire as dowry. The real motivation was likely plunder and the further humiliation of the Roman state. Imagine the sheer scale of his army, a vast horde sweeping across the landscape, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Cities like Metz were utterly destroyed, their populations massacred. The fear of Attila united unlikely adversaries. Faced with this existential threat, the Western Roman general Aetius, a man often called the last of the Romans, and himself of partial barbarian heritage, forged a desperate and improbable alliance with his former enemies, the Visigoths. Aetius was a complex figure, a Roman of great military skill and political acumen, who had spent much of his youth as a hostage among the Huns and other barbarian groups, gaining an intimate understanding of their ways. He was the de facto ruler of the Western Empire, much like Stilicho before him, but constantly at odds with the jealous Emperor Valentinian III. In 451 AD, Aetius, leading a Roman army that was itself heavily composed of allied federates, including Franks and Burgundians, confronted Attila and his Hunnic confederation in a massive, epic showdown known as the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, or sometimes the Battle of Chalons. This was not a minor skirmish. It was one of the largest and most destructive battles of late antiquity, a collision of empires and cultures. The plains of Gaul were said to have been soaked with blood. The fighting was fierce and protracted. The key to the Romang and Visigothic alliance was the aging but still formidable Visigothic King Theodoric I. At the height of the battle, Theodoric was struck down and killed, but his son Thorismund rallied the Visigothic forces, preventing a collapse. Aetius deployed his forces with tactical brilliance, using the terrain to his advantage and leveraging the strengths of his diverse army. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains ended in a strategic victory for the Romans and their allies. While the army of Attila was not annihilated, and he was able to withdraw in order, his advance into Gaul was decisively halted. The Huns suffered heavy losses, and their reputation for invincibility was shattered. It was a moment of immense relief for the beleaguered West, a testament to what could still be achieved when Roman leadership and barbarian cooperation aligned effectively. However, Attila was not defeated for long. The very next year, in 452 AD, he invaded Italy, bypassing Aetius and his forces in Gaul and sweeping down the peninsula. He sacked and destroyed the wealthy city of Aquileia, leaving it a desolate ruin, and laid waste to other cities in northern Italy. The road to Rome lay open. Yet, for reasons still debated by historians, Attila suddenly turned back, choosing not to sack the imperial capital. Pope Leo I, along with two prominent senators, famously met Attila outside Rome, reportedly convincing him to spare the city through a combination of diplomatic pleas and perhaps a hefty tribute. Other factors likely played a role, including the ravages of disease and famine in his army, the threat of an Eastern Roman attack on his supply lines, and perhaps even a superstitious fear of the fate that had befallen Alaric shortly after sacking Rome. Attila returned to his Pannonian heartland and died mysteriously in 453 AD, reportedly from a hemorrhage on his wedding night. With his death, the Hunnic Empire, so dependent on his personal leadership, swiftly disintegrated, its various subject tribes scattering or falling into conflict with each other. The immediate Hunnic threat to Rome dissipated, but the damage had already been done. The Huns had dramatically reshaped the barbarian landscape, pushing more Germanic peoples into the Roman sphere and further destabilizing the western frontiers. The period following the death of Attila brought little respite for the Western Roman Empire. The political situation in Italy descended into an almost farcical state of instability, characterized by a rapid succession of puppet emperors, elevated and deposed by powerful barbarian military commanders. These were the true powers behind the throne, the magistri militum or masters of soldiers, who, despite their often barbarian origins, wielded immense influence over the imperial court. One of the most prominent of these kingmakers was Ricimer, a Suebic general who dominated Western Roman politics for nearly 2 decades. From 456 to 472, AD, Ricimer was a figure of immense military and political power, often controlling the appointment of emperors. He would select a suitable, often weak, Roman noble, place him on the throne, and then, if the emperor proved uncooperative or ineffective, arrange for his deposition or assassination. This dynamic made the imperial title a mere formality, stripped of any real authority. The emperors were simply puppets, their reigns brief and largely symbolic, their power residing entirely in the hands of the Germanic generals who controlled the army. Ricimer installed a series of such emperors: Majorian, Libius, Severus, Anthemius, and Olybrius, each one a testament to the increasing powerlessness of the imperial office. Majorian, for example, a capable general himself, attempted some genuine reforms and even launched a significant naval expedition against the Vandals in North Africa. A bold but ultimately failed attempt to reclaim that vital province. However, his independence angered Ricimer, who had him executed in 461 AD. The Western Roman Empire, by this point, was a shadow of its former self. Its territory was fragmented, its economy shattered, its population diminished, and its political authority hollowed out. Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa were largely under the control of various barbarian kingdoms: the Visigoths, the Suebi, the Vandals, and the Burgundians. Only Italy, parts of southern Gaul, and a few scattered enclaves remained under nominal Roman rule, and even these were often administered by powerful generals or local aristocrats with little real loyalty to the Ravenna court. The constant internal power struggles, the endless barbarian incursions, and the lack of a strong, unified leadership meant that the Western Roman Empire was slowly bleeding out, not with a sudden violent end, but through a gradual, agonizing process of attrition and dissolution. The imperial purple, once the most coveted symbol of power and glory, was now a dangerous burden, a costume worn by a succession of weak figures, their strings pulled by the true masters of the dwindling Roman state. The final act of this long, drawn-out drama was rapidly approaching, almost as a quiet formality, for the reality of Western Roman power had already largely vanished. The final act of this long, drawn-out drama was rapidly approaching, almost as a quiet formality, for the reality of Western Roman power had already largely vanished. The series of puppet emperors, controlled by figures like Ricimer, continued even after his death in 472 AD. His successor as the paramount Germanic general in Italy was Gundobad, a Burgundian who elevated Gaiseric to the imperial purple. However, the Eastern Roman Emperor Leo I, ever mindful of his imperial prerogatives and the need for a more legitimate figure in the West, nominated Julius Nepos, a Roman general and nephew of the Eastern Empress Verina. Nepos successfully deposed Gaiseric in 474 AD, briefly restoring a semblance of Roman authority to the Western throne. Julius Nepos, a man of considerable capabilities, attempted to reassert imperial authority and even negotiated with the Visigoths for the return of some Roman territory. In Gaul, he aimed to stabilize the dwindling Western Empire, but his reign was destined to be short-lived. In 475 AD, a new figure rose to prominence in Italy: Flavius Orestes. Orestes was a Roman citizen from Pannonia, but crucially, he had once served as a secretary and envoy to Attila the Hun, an indication of the complex and often fluid loyalties of the late Roman world. Now Magister Militum himself, Orestes led a mutiny against Julius Nepos. Nepos, lacking significant military support in Italy, fled to Dalmatia, where he would continue to claim the title of Western Roman Emperor, though his actual power was negligible. With Nepos driven out, Orestes found himself in a peculiar position. He had the power to install an emperor, but perhaps due to a mix of ambition and a reluctance to take the purple himself, he chose not to. Instead, he elevated his own young son, a boy barely in his teens, to the imperial throne. This boy was named Romulus Augustulus. Imagine a scene in Ravenna, the marshy, defensible capital of the Western Empire, in the late summer of 475 AD. A young boy, perhaps bewildered by the weight of the imperial purple and the solemnity of the ceremony, is presented to the dwindling court. His full name, Romulus Augustulus, was a cruel irony. Romulus linking him to the legendary founder of Rome, and Augustulus, a diminutive of Augustus, meaning Little Augustus, a name that perfectly encapsulated the diminished state of the empire he now nominally ruled. He was a child emperor, a figurehead whose power was entirely dependent on the military backing of his father. His reign was nothing more than a brief, final flicker of a flame about to be extinguished. The power of Romulus Augustulus was entirely nominal, a mere facade over the true authority held by his father, Orestes. However, Orestes soon faced a challenge from within his own barbarian mercenary forces. These Germanic federates, composed of Heruli, Syri, and other tribes, demanded a third of the land in Italy for themselves, a common practice for settled barbarian groups. Orestes, perhaps fearful of alienating the remaining Roman landowners, or simply unwilling to concede such a vast portion of Italy, refused their demands. This refusal proved to be his undoing. The disgruntled barbarian soldiers, united under the leadership of a powerful Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, rose in revolt. Odoacer, a Syrian general who had served in the Ricimer army, was a formidable and charismatic figure. He rallied the federates, promising them the land that Orestes had denied. In August of 476 AD, Odoacer and his forces moved against Orestes. Orestes was quickly defeated and captured near Piacenza, and then executed on August 28, 476 AD. With the father disposed of, Odoacer marched on Ravenna, the last bastion of imperial power in the west. The young Romulus Augustulus, now stripped of the protection of his father, was utterly powerless. On September 4th, 476 AD, Odoacer entered Ravenna. He did not, however, execute the boy emperor, perhaps out of a degree of mercy, or perhaps recognizing the symbolic weight of the imperial office. Odoacer compelled Romulus Augustulus to abdicate his throne. The boy was sent into comfortable retirement with a pension, eventually settling in a villa in Campania. It was a remarkably quiet, almost understated end to the line of Western Roman emperors that stretched back nearly 5 centuries to Augustus himself. What happened next was perhaps even more symbolic than the deposition itself. Odoacer, rather than taking the imperial purple for himself, which he surely could have done, chose a different path. He sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robes, and other symbols of Western imperial authority to the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. Along with these symbols, he sent a delegation to Zeno, formally requesting that he be recognized not as an emperor, but as Patricius a Roman noble, and as the rightful ruler of Italy, governing it on behalf of the Eastern Emperor. He argued that one emperor was sufficient for both East and West, effectively acknowledging the de facto reality that the Western Empire had ceased to function as an independent imperial entity. Emperor Zeno, after some hesitation, acceded to the request of Odoacer, recognizing him as a patrician and legitimate ruler of Italy, while still considering Julius Nepos, who remained in Dalmatia, as the last rightful Western emperor. This act, the sending of the regalia, was profoundly significant. It was not a barbaric king declaring himself emperor of Rome, but rather a powerful Germanic chieftain acknowledging the supremacy of the Eastern Roman Empire, thereby symbolically reuniting the imperial office, if not the actual territory. Thus, 476 AD, with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, has long been recognized as the traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But it is crucial to understand that this was not a sudden, cataclysmic event universally recognized as such by contemporaries. Many people living at the time likely perceived it as merely another change of regime, another barbarian general taking control, not an apocalyptic end to the Roman world. The institutions, the laws, the language, and much of the Roman way of life continued in Italy and elsewhere under the new Germanic rulers. The Eastern Roman Empire continued to thrive, carrying on the Roman legacy for another millennium. The fall in 476 AD was, in many ways, an administrative and symbolic end, the logical conclusion of a long process of decline that had hollowed out the Western Empire from within. It was the formal acknowledgement that the political and military machinery of the Western Roman state had simply ceased to function effectively. The constant internal power struggles, the economic debasement, the devastating plagues, the persistent barbarian pressures, and the increasing reliance on non-Roman peoples for its very defense had all contributed to this quiet dissolution. The empire had not been conquered by a single overwhelming force. It had slowly, painfully, and almost imperceptibly transformed itself out of existence, giving way to a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms that would inherit its lands and reshape the future of Europe. So, why did Rome fall? This question, seemingly simple, has vexed historians for centuries, and there is no single easy answer. Instead, the decline of the Western Roman Empire was a complex tapestry woven from a multitude of interacting factors, a slow, agonizing process of internal decay and external pressures that gradually eroded its once formidable strength. Let us begin to unravel some of these threads, starting with the internal vulnerabilities that made the Western Empire so susceptible to its ultimate fate. One of the most insidious forms of internal decay was the persistent political instability that plagued the empire, particularly after the Pax Romana. The system of imperial succession was never truly formalized, leading to constant uncertainty and often violent struggles for power. The crisis of the 3rd century, as we have seen, was a prime example of this, with emperors rising and falling at the whims of their legions. Even after Diocletian and Constantine attempted to regularize succession, the problem persisted, especially in the West. This constant political turmoil drained resources, diverted attention from pressing external threats, and undermined the loyalty and trust of the populace in the central government. Each civil war meant legions fighting against legions, weakening the overall military capacity of the empire and leaving its frontiers exposed. The imperial court itself became a hotbed of intrigue and corruption. Powerful eunuchs, ambitious generals, and scheming aristocrats often held more sway than the emperors themselves, particularly the weak emperors of the late Western Empire. This pervasive corruption permeated the bureaucracy, leading to inefficiency, injustice, and a further erosion of public trust. The collection of taxes became more burdensome for the common people, while the wealthy often found ways to evade their responsibilities, exacerbating social inequality and fueling resentment. The idea of public service, once a cherished Roman ideal, began to wane, replaced by self-interest and a narrow focus on personal gain. Economically, the Western Empire suffered from chronic and escalating problems. The rampant inflation of the 3rd century, brought about by continuous currency debasement, never truly recovered. Even with attempts at monetary reform, confidence in the imperial coinage remained low. This hampered trade, forcing a retreat into a more localized, barter-based economy, particularly in the less urbanized West. The loss of key provinces, like North Africa to the Vandals, severed vital arteries of trade and severely impacted the grain supply, leading to recurrent famines and making the remaining Roman heartland dependent on unpredictable barbarian rulers for its sustenance. The tax base, already strained by military expenses and corruption, continued to shrink as populations declined and productive lands were lost. The state responded by increasing tax burdens on those who remained, further impoverishing the populace and stifling economic activity. The reliance on a slave economy, while initially a source of wealth, also presented long-term limitations. As the empire ceased to expand, the supply of new slaves dwindled. The economic model, which had relied on cheap labor for agriculture and industry, began to stagnate. While there were shifts towards free tenant farmers, the colony asterisk, this system also tied people to the land and limited social mobility, hindering innovation and growth. The overall economy of the West became less dynamic, less adaptable, and less capable of generating the wealth needed to sustain a vast army and bureaucracy. This slow economic strangulation, more than any single battle, was a relentless force eroding the foundations of the Western Empire. This slow economic strangulation, more than any single battle, was a relentless force eroding the foundations of the Western Empire. Beyond the purely economic factors, the social structures of Rome also underwent a profound and ultimately weakening transformation. The traditional ideal of the independent, land-owning Roman citizen who proudly served in the legions and participated in civic life gradually faded. The increasing concentration of land in the hands of a few wealthy aristocrats, combined with the crushing burden of taxation and the constant threat of barbarian incursions, forced many small farmers and free peasants into dependency. They became, as we discussed, coloni, tied to the estates of powerful landowners, exchanging their freedom and labor for a measure of protection and subsistence. This system, while providing a degree of stability in a chaotic world, fundamentally altered the social contract. The number of free citizens capable of contributing meaningfully to the military or civic institutions dwindled. Loyalty shifted from the distant, ineffective imperial government to the local magnate who could provide immediate security and food. The very notion of a unified Roman people with shared rights and responsibilities across the empire began to dissipate, replaced by localized allegiances and a fragmented social landscape that increasingly resembled the feudal systems of the coming Middle Ages. The decline of civic virtue, a concept deeply cherished by earlier Romans, also played its part. The public spirit, the willingness to sacrifice for the common good of Rome, seemed to wane. Corruption became endemic, with officials more concerned with personal enrichment than with the welfare of the state. The games and spectacles in the amphitheaters, while still drawing crowds, perhaps served more as a distraction from the growing miseries of daily life than as a celebration of Roman grandeur. The pursuit of luxury and private comfort among the elite contrasted starkly with the deepening poverty of the masses, further widening the chasm between social classes and fostering a sense of cynicism and apathy towards the fate of the empire. Militarily, too, Rome faced internal challenges that compounded its external pressures. While the Roman army had always been its backbone, its character changed dramatically in the late empire. The traditional citizen soldier, fighting for his republic and his homeland, was largely a thing of the past. The legions became increasingly composed of professional soldiers, often recruited from the frontier provinces and, crucially, from barbarian federates. These barbarian units, while often fiercely effective in battle, held primary loyalty not to Rome, but to their own commanders and their own ethnic groups. Their integration into the Roman military was a pragmatic necessity, filling the ranks that Roman citizens were less and less willing or able to occupy. However, it also meant that the defense of Rome was increasingly entrusted to those whose ultimate allegiance was not to the imperial idea itself, but to their own people's survival and gain. This created a double-edged sword, a powerful fighting force, but one that could, and often did, turn against the very empire it was meant to defend. This reliance on barbarian soldiers was a testament to the demographic decline and the dwindling availability of Roman citizens for military service. The plagues had decimated populations, and those who remained were often tied to the land by the colony system, making recruitment difficult. The costs of maintaining such a large, professionalized, and increasingly barbarianized army were astronomical, further straining the already collapsing imperial treasury and driving the need for ever higher and often destructive taxation. And so, these internal struggles, political instability, economic collapse, social fragmentation, and the changing nature of the military created a Western Roman Empire that was profoundly weakened from within. It was a state with a hollowed-out core, a fragile shell that, despite its grand historical legacy, was ill-equipped to withstand the relentless barrage of external pressures that were now assaulting its every frontier. These external pressures were not new, but their intensity and coordination in the 4th and 5th centuries were unprecedented. The vastness of the empire, which had been its strength during its expansionist phases, now became a debilitating burden. It had immense sprawling borders, stretching thousands of miles across rivers, mountains, and deserts. Each segment required constant vigilance and large garrisons, diffusing Rome's military strength across too many points. The strategic depth that Rome once enjoyed, the ability to absorb incursions and launch counterattacks from internal reserves, was increasingly lost as barbarian groups settled within its own territory. The shift from an offensive, expansionist posture to a defensive, reactive one was costly both financially and psychologically. Instead of gaining wealth and slaves from conquest, Rome was now pouring its dwindling resources into defending existing territory, often fighting battles on its own soil. The constant warfare exhausted manpower and treasuries, preventing any sustained period of recovery or investment. The threat was multi-directional. The Sassanid Persians in the east, a sophisticated and organized empire, demanded constant attention, while numerous Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube presented a continuous, chaotic, and often unpredictable challenge. Moreover, the nature of these barbarian movements was not merely one of raiding. Many of these groups, particularly after the push of the Huns, were entire peoples on the move, seeking new homes and arable land. They were not easily bought off or repelled, for they had nowhere else to go. Their migrations represented a profound demographic shift, an unstoppable tide of humanity that Rome simply did not have the manpower or resources to fully absorb or effectively resist. The Goths, the Vandals, the Suebi, the Alans, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Saxons. These were not just names of enemies, but names of peoples who were fundamentally reshaping the demographic and political map of Europe, often with little regard for Roman borders or imperial authority. The Western Roman Empire, with its weaker economy and less defensible frontiers compared to the East, bore the brunt of these migrations, while the Eastern Empire, with its wealth concentrated around Constantinople, often managed to deflect or buy off these barbarian threats, sending them westward. The West found itself directly in their path. The loss of rich provinces like Gaul, Hispania, and most critically North Africa to these migrating groups was not just a loss of territory. It was a loss of the very economic and military foundations upon which the empire relied. The grain of North Africa, the manpower of Gaul, the silver mines of Hispania, all fell out of Roman hands, further crippling the ability of the Western state to fight back. Compounding these military and economic woes were the insidious impacts of climate change and recurrent diseases. While not always directly cited as causes, these environmental factors played a subtle yet significant role. Periods of climatic instability, such as colder, wetter seasons or prolonged droughts, could severely impact agricultural yields, leading to famines that further weakened populations already susceptible to disease. The Roman economy, particularly in the West, was heavily agrarian, and widespread crop failures could have devastating ripple effects. The repeated waves of plague, the Antonine and Ciprianic plagues, had already taken a massive toll on the Roman population in previous centuries. While the 5th century did not see epidemics of quite the same scale, the general health of the populace was likely diminished by constant warfare, famine, and dislocation. A smaller, weaker population meant fewer taxpayers, fewer soldiers, and less productive labor, creating a demographic deficit that the empire struggled to overcome. These environmental factors, though often overlooked in grand narratives of imperial decline, created a background hum of hardship and vulnerability that further hastened the unraveling of the Western Roman state. So, the decline of the Western Roman Empire was not a singular event, but a multifaceted process. It was a slow, agonizing interaction between internal fragilities and external pressures. A complex interplay of political short-sightedness, economic mismanagement, social transformation, military overextension, and environmental challenges. No one factor alone was sufficient, but their combined, relentless assault gradually overwhelmed a system that had become too large, too rigid, and too internally divided to adapt effectively to a rapidly changing world. The grand edifice of Rome in the West, meticulously built over centuries, crumbled not with a sudden crash, but by degrees, quietly, like an ancient building slowly succumbing to the elements, its once mighty walls giving way stone by stone. The new world that emerged from its ruins would be dramatically different, a testament to the enduring influence of Rome, even in its disappearance. The new world that emerged from its ruins would be dramatically different, a testament to the enduring influence of Rome, even in its disappearance. In the immediate aftermath of 476 AD, the landscape of the former Western Roman Empire was not a desolate wasteland, but a complex mosaic of nascent Germanic kingdoms, each built upon the crumbling foundations of Roman administration and culture. These barbarian rulers, far from simply destroying what they found, often sought to appropriate and continue the Roman legacy in their own ways. In Italy, the reign of Odoacer, the Germanic chieftain who deposed Romulus Augustulus, marked a crucial period of transition. Odoacer, having sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, established himself as the ruler of Italy, ostensibly on behalf of the Eastern Roman Emperor. He maintained many aspects of the Roman administrative system, retaining Roman officials and the traditional structures of governance. The Senate of Rome, though its political power was long diminished, continued to function, its members often enjoying a comfortable existence under the rule of Odoacer. For the average inhabitant of Italy, life under Odoacer may have initially felt like a continuation of Roman rule, simply with a new military master. He respected Roman laws and customs for the Roman population, while his own Germanic followers lived under their distinct tribal laws. However, Odoacer himself would eventually be overthrown by another, even more formidable Germanic power, the Ostrogoths, led by their brilliant king, Theodoric the Great. Theodoric, who had spent a significant portion of his youth as a hostage in Constantinople, developed a deep appreciation for Roman culture and administration. Sent by the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno to oust Odoacer, Theodoric conquered Italy after a protracted war, establishing the Ostrogothic kingdom in 493 AD under Theodoric. Italy experienced a period of relative stability and prosperity, a brief Indian summer of late Roman civilization. Theodoric consciously sought to blend Gothic military strength with Roman administrative efficiency and cultural sophistication. His famous dictum, Roma caput mundi, or Rome is the head of the world, reflected his deep respect for the imperial legacy. He saw himself as a protector of Roman culture, rather than its destroyer. Roman citizens continued to be governed by Roman law, administered by Roman officials, and to practice their Catholic Christianity. The Goths, on the other hand, lived under their own laws, followed their Arian Christian faith, and provided the military muscle for the kingdom. This system, known as apartheid by custom, aimed to maintain distinct identities while fostering cooperation under a single ruler. Theodoric patronized Roman arts and letters, restored ancient buildings, and generally sought to revive a sense of order and civilization. His reign, from 493 to 526 AD, showcased that even in the West, Roman institutions could endure and adapt under capable Germanic leadership. Elsewhere in the former Western Empire, similar processes of transformation were unfolding. In Gaul and Hispania, the Visigoths, under leaders like Alaric and Alaric II, established powerful kingdoms. While their relationship with the Roman populations was often more tumultuous than the rule of Theodoric in Italy, They too gradually adopted Roman administrative practices, particularly in tax collection and provincial governance. Roman law, often codified and simplified, continued to be applied to the Roman inhabitants, while the Visigoths maintained their own customary laws. The Frankish kingdom, under Clovis, beginning in the late 5th century, emerged as another significant power in northern Gaul. The conversion of Clovis to Nicene Christianity around 500 AD was a strategic move that allowed him to gain the crucial support of the Gallo-Roman aristocracy and the Catholic Church, setting the Franks on a path to dominate Western Europe. In North Africa, the Vandal kingdom established by Gaiseric, though more hostile to the Roman elite and the Catholic Church due to their Arian faith, nevertheless relied on many existing Roman structures for its functioning. The Vandals maintained a strong naval presence and controlled valuable trade routes, but the Roman villas and agricultural estates continued to produce goods, albeit under new masters. What is vital to grasp is that the fall of Rome was not a single event that plunged Europe into a sudden dark abyss. Instead, it was a protracted process of political fragmentation, economic localization, and cultural synthesis. The barbarian kingdoms that emerged were not entirely alien entities. They were deeply influenced by the Roman world they inherited. Latin remained the language of administration, law, and the church. Roman legal principles, though simplified and combined with Germanic customs, continued to shape justice. Roman architectural styles, albeit in simpler forms, persisted. The Christian Church, which had grown immensely powerful under Constantine and Theodosius, served as a crucial bridge, preserving Roman learning, language, and administrative structures, often becoming the primary institutional link between the old Roman world and the new Germanic kingdoms. Bishops, many of them from old Roman aristocratic families, often took on civic responsibilities that the dwindling imperial administration could no longer provide, becoming leaders and protectors of their communities. While the Western Empire withered, its eastern counterpart, the Eastern Roman Empire, which would eventually become known as the Byzantine Empire, not only survived but thrived. This was not due to some inherent superiority of the East, but to a confluence of factors that provided it with greater resilience. Geographically, Constantinople was strategically placed, a formidable fortress city that was far more defensible against barbarian attacks than Rome or Ravenna had ever been. Its control over the vital trade routes between East and West, and its proximity to the rich agricultural lands of Asia Minor and Egypt, ensured a more robust and stable economy. The East was also more urbanized, with larger, wealthier cities that could generate significant tax revenues and manpower. Politically, the Eastern Empire often managed to deflect barbarian threats away from its heartland, frequently buying them off or redirecting them towards the less resilient West. Its administrative bureaucracy, largely inherited from Diocletian and Constantine, remained more centralized and efficient, allowing for better tax collection and greater imperial control. And while it faced its own challenges, including the persistent threat from the Sassanid Persians, the East generally avoided the devastating civil wars and rapid succession of puppet emperors that crippled the West. Its continuation of Roman law, Greek culture, and Orthodox Christianity allowed it to maintain a distinct, enduring identity that persisted for another 1,000 years, long after the last vestiges of Roman imperial power faded from the West.